Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ben Switzer. I am a VP of Solutions at Tenthline, here to talk about a solution that Tenthline developed for Walmart Canada. The title of our session today is Digital Asset Management for Walmart Canada's walmart.ca. It's a bit of a mouthful, but hopefully I'll be able to explain it all to you through the course of this session. Thank you for joining me here today. I know there are a number of other sessions that are ongoing at this very moment that I would rather be part of, but I've been asked to give this talk, so thanks for joining me. And we're going to step through the solution, and at the end, if you have any questions, I'd be happy to answer if I can. So Walmart probably doesn't need any introduction to anyone in this room, I presume. Multinational corporation, many offices, I guess sub-corporations, if you will, around the world. So we're talking specifically about Walmart Canada. Walmart Canada redeveloped their primary consumer-facing website, walmart.ca, last year. Went live, I believe, January or February of this year. And Tenthline was tapped to build digital asset management using Alfresco specifically for this larger solution. So when I'm talking about the solution, I'm going to only be talking about the architecture, the integration, the customization, and replication as it pertains to Alfresco. There are other pieces to the solution that was built by another party that I don't have a lot of knowledge of, and we are not going to cover here today. So the architecture was fairly straightforward from the Alfresco point of view. Alfresco Enterprise 4.1 was the latest flavor at the time. So we were running that on Red Hat, backed by an Oracle 11G database. The repo tier, as well as Share and Solar, are all running on the single VM, all within the same JVM, actually. The other pieces to the solution involved Oracle Experience Manager, as well as a web tier running a custom application built in the Play framework developed using Scala. And the third piece to the architecture was the Alfresco File Transfer Receiver, which I will refer to as FTR moving forward. The FTR is a component released by Alfresco to be used with their repositories. If you need, for example, content from the repo on a file system or another repo located somewhere else. We're going to talk individually about each of these integration points, so the FTR, the Oracle Experience Manager, and then the custom application. So for the FTR, you'll notice that in the diagram here on the slide, there's a little Alfresco icon on both the web tier and the Oracle Experience Manager boxes. And that's to indicate that the FTR is actually running in those environments. So what the FTR is it's a Java application that you spin up in your VM, and the remote repository can connect to those FTRs to push content both way, or push or pull content, I guess. In the case of this solution, we are simply pushing content that had been approved by end users in Alfresco Share to the different endpoints. So there are certain types of content that was being pushed to the Oracle Experience Manager, and there are other digital assets that are being pushed out to the web tier or web servers. On the web server side, there was a CDN as well that was set up, content delivery network, that, I guess, replicated the content to make it more readily accessible to all of the users for walmart.ca. The FTR itself, like I said, is a fairly straightforward Java application. Unfortunately, we had to modify or customize the code for the FTR in that it wasn't able to run a post-replication script. So out of the box, it would accept content or push content back to the repo, but there was no way to trigger a local script, for example, to run after a replication job had run. That code actually was taken from another Alfresco component called the FSR, the File System Receiver, or otherwise known as the Deployment Receiver. If being open source, which is one of the wonders of Alfresco, you can actually dig in and look at some of this code. So I had a look at the FSR and FTR and wondered why In the FTR, the callback functionality didn't exist, but did exist in the FSR. The code was virtually identical, short of that. So I copied and pasted, which is every developer's worst nightmare, but we find ourselves doing it more often than we'd like to admit, and applied that patch to the FTR. And lo and behold, that provided the functionality that we needed to be able to call a local script on the Linux host after a replication job was done. Subsequent to that, a patch was submitted to Alfresco and has been sitting in their Jira for the last year or so. Maybe they'll include it, maybe they won't. I don't know if there's anyone from Alfresco here can answer, yeah, why or how we might promote those partner-provided patches into the repo a bit more, but we can talk about that some other time. The Oracle Experience Manager integration shared data in two directions. So as I'd just indicated, the Oracle Experience Manager VM, or the VM that was running the Experience Manager, hosted a FTR instance. So the data being pushed, replicated from the repo into Experience Manager was one direction of that data flow. And the other direction is a web script that was developed, and I'll talk a bit more in this session later, where the repo was consuming XML data out of Experience Manager. So what needed to happen was Alfresco needed to make a remote HTTP call into Experience Manager to get XML as it related to brands, categories, and products, which was then used by the end user to build pages with. And then thirdly, the integration with the Play application. I refer to it simply as Play because it was based on the Play framework. I think the company had its own name, but I was never privy to that. Is simply a one-way or one-directional information push from the repo into the web tier, again running FTR. And then the Play application did some parsing of the HTML files that were generated by way of Experience Manager to make sure that they properly were referencing the digital assets that were available to it. The customization of Alfresco and Share repository, as well as, I guess, the development that happened, can be broken up into these sections. So I'm going to first talk about the repository and then talk more about the specific customizations that were done in Alfresco Share. So there were several behaviors that were developed in the repository. These behaviors triggered code based on updates or creation of certain content types. So within the repository, we had modeled different types for different page types that Walmart wanted to be able to use a solution for. So whenever one of these page types was created or updated, these behaviors would trigger. And these behaviors were developed specifically to take all of the properties that were attached to a node that had just been input through a share form, build an XML file, and then drop that XML file back into the content property of that node. So you had a node that had both several custom properties as well as the XML that had been generated in the content property of that node. So if you were to navigate to that node in Alfresco Share, you would see the XML, even though if you went to edit the properties, you'd be presented with a custom form with all of the properties populated from the aspects that were attached to that node type. Several web scripts were developed for this solution as well, ranging from retrieving content out of Experience Manager. So I had indicated earlier that the integration with Experience Manager required Alfresco to reach into Experience Manager to get XML and bring that back to the user in Alfresco Share. So when we talk about specifically the object picker here in a few minutes, I'll get into more details about how those mechanics work or works. And there was web scripts developed as well for running and creating replication jobs. So for anyone who's familiar with replication jobs, in Alfresco, you know that there are two pieces that are required. One is what's referred to as the transfer target, and the other is the actual replication job. And there's a one-to-one relationship, and we'll talk again more about that as we move forward. So moving to Alfresco Share now, there were several customizations done. One was creating a share page, custom share page, which is well documented and understood. I think the documentation that Alfresco provides to create custom share pages is fairly straightforward. There's nothing special about this page. What this page allowed the end users to do was to approve assets that were pending or awaiting approval. The reason that we decided not to use the built-in search page and functionality was that the search results page in Alfresco Share as of 4.1 was not customizable or extendable. You had to basically replace it, which is something that we didn't want to do. So we created this custom page that reached out to a web script in the repo side to get a result set of all of the pending assets awaiting approval, and displayed them and allowed the users to interact with them. They could approve or deny, provide reasons and comments right from that one page. So I'm going to move on now to the forms and object picker. Hands up here for anyone who's had experience developing forms within Alfresco Share. Just the Alfresco guys in the back? Okay. Alfresco Share forms are fairly straightforward in their ability to display various properties you have on a node, whether those properties are coming from the type or the aspect. It's pretty irrelevant. But if you build a large form, you quickly realize how unruly the XML configuration files can become, or at least I realized that very quickly. So one of the workarounds or not workarounds, one of the solutions to that problem was to separate out into its own file each form. So we had a different form type for each of the page types, which were represented in the data dictionary as their own data types. So we had a file for each one, just to keep them contained and make sense of them for maintenance moving forward. And part of the verboseness, if that's a word, of XML is, well, I guess that's sort of the issue I'm trying to state, is that XML is very verbose. And to make it easier for the end users, a lot of nested sets were used, meaning, so for example, you can see this box here is around the basic properties. And we did that throughout these forms to try and logically group properties together to make it easier for the end user to populate the content that's required of them. Several custom controls were developed. One is what I refer to as the image picker and the image deselector. So if you look at this slide here, there's an image of a black camera and a little red X beside it. The image selector is the thumbnail there of the camera, and if a user was to click on it, they would see a pop-up that would display a file browser, allow them to navigate through a predefined node structure. Well, not predefined, but it would start at the top of the approved assets folder, and they could navigate down from there to find the asset they want to include on the page that they're building. Whether that asset was an image or a video, they could navigate to it, view the properties on it, ensure that it is the one that they want, and then select it. Once they've selected it, a thumbnail would be displayed, the window would be closed, and would be displayed on the form page. And when that image is being displayed, there was a reference to the node being stored in the form as well that is later used in the generation of the XML. Excuse me. It's a problem having a talk right after lunch. And conversely, the little red X gets rid of the reference to the image that they select and returns the thumbnail back to the black camera. So those are just a couple examples of the custom controls that were implemented for this solution, and we'll see a few more in a minute. A decision was made to replace the default WYSIWYG editor in Alfresco Share. We replaced it with CK editor. It was a drop-in replacement, and the reason that decision was made primarily was driven by the ability to use this plugin. So this actual file browser is a CK editor plugin that allowed us to extend it fairly easily. So the CK editor plugin we modified to make a call to a web script in our repo tier to get all of the nodes and then display them, allow the user to navigate them. So that is why we ended up with CK editor. Functionality-wise, it's very similar to the default WYSIWYG editor you find in Share today. Again, another example of a nested set is the box around here. So this set of properties is referred to as fragment A. Navigating further down the form, you would find B, C, D, and D and E, and I think a couple of the previous sets above it are all collapsed. So this is another example of a custom control where the Walmart didn't want these page forms being a mile long, so what they wanted is just to compact them so that until they were either required by the user or not required at all, a user could click the ad and it would simply display the HTML. And here's another example of another nested set. So we have one inside another, which leads to a lot of XML. And the last custom control I want to talk about is the object picker. So out of the box, the object picker can select nodes within your repository. But we needed a mechanism to select data from an external system. So what we did was we extended the object picker to call our own custom web script. That web script connected to Experience Manager, Oracle Experience Manager, to get the XML, parse that XML into JSON, and then present that JSON to the Alfresco, or sorry, the Share component. So when a user clicks one of those buttons, this window pops up and allows the user to choose, in this case, I think it's brands, Melrose Place, the 4th season. Those are products, I guess. They can select one or more, depending on whether or not that field allowed them to. And then clicking OK would display that selected item like it would with the regular object picker. The information that came back from the Experience Manager was stored as a key value pair in that property, which again later was parsed into XML and then shared with Experience Manager again. The document library is also well documented as it pertains to customization. Several customizations were done on the library, such as changing the create content menu items. So by default, you can generate XML or a plain text or a Word doc. I can't remember the ones out of the box. But we didn't want the users to be able to create those types of documents because they had no value. So we replaced them with our own content types. We created several status indicators. I don't think you can see that from the back of the room, but it's basically a little document with a clock in it to indicate that that document is pending approval. Custom metadata templates. The metadata template is actually this whole section here. So what we did was we replicated the existing and then added our own status indicators. It's another form of status indicator, I guess, a supplemental one, if you will, to each of the nodes. Again, pending what stage that document was within the workflow. And then lastly, the change or the customization as it relates to the actions. So we added approve asset and reject asset. And we also removed some other actions that are available out of the box just to minimize the potential for errors or just confusion. And the three last customizations, the actions, the metadata template, and the status indicator were all use evaluators within Share to determine whether or not they should be displayed or not. There are a bunch of evaluators out of the box, and I think we used one that simply determined whether a property was true or false based on its presence on that node. And then lastly, we're going to talk about replication. So I indicated earlier that there's this one-to-one relationship between transfer target nodes and replication jobs. So to make the job easier for the DevOps guys that are maintaining this now, we created a web script where they simply plug in a name and a folder structure name, or I guess a destination, and creates the corresponding transfer target and replication job for them instead of having them navigate into the repo. The transfer targets and corresponding jobs were grouped into two logical groups, or grouped into two logical areas. One to push XML to Experience Manager, and basically everything else went to the web tier. There was also another web script that was developed that gets triggered when a asset is approved. The asset triggers an action on the approved, or sorry, there's a rule on the approved folder that triggers a script, which adds a value to a data list that is queried every 5 minutes to determine whether a replication job needed to run or not. If it was found that a replication job did need to run, this web script was triggered that actually calls the repository's own replication service and then triggered the appropriate replication jobs by iterating through all of them and finding the ones that match using a name convention. And that is my talk for today. I hope you have learned something and taken some value piece of information away. Any questions? Yes?
So you mentioned that the XML coming over from Experience Manager was in the repository and also was in properties.
The XML came over, yes, and the users could select it.
But it was parsed and put in some of the information in XML was in the properties?
The XML that came over was put in a property if the user had selected it.
Right. So what would happen, or how do you avoid a situation where something changes in one, does it automatically update the other?
That is a very good question, and I had that question for the other dev team. They said
Or we don't allow that to happen?
we don't allow that to happen is basically the answer, yes. Every product, brand, or category had a unique ID, and if a new one was to, or one was to change, they would simply add a new one. There was never any changes made, which could lead to a huge data set, but that's the way they tackled that. Good question. Any other questions from the back?
How long did this engagement with Walmart last to get the solution?
Good question. I didn't mention that actually. The solution was implemented in about 5 months. Any other questions? No? Oh, yeah.
Are the digital assets being placed initially into Alfresco, or they're getting brought in from?
No, they're being put in Alfresco off the top. Yes, exactly. Either dragged and dropped right into Share or uploaded. But that's where their life begins in Alfresco.
And do they have any creative workflow type things where people are looking at these images, making changes to them, and work in process? I know you mentioned that there are things that are approved. I presume there are things that aren't approved.
That's right. I was not privy to the workflow sort of outside of Alfresco, unfortunately. Good question, though. Thank you. All right. Well, thank you, everyone. Are there any more questions?